I just told Sebastian that I've never felt more superfluous in my entire career. And yet, we will go on.
Yeah.
I will not begin this with singing, luckily, for everybody here. I want to start out with some considerations about family and writing. Your friend, the wonderful novelist Colm Tóibín, once wrote in an essay that he wrote about your play, Hinterlands, wrote about the connection between an artist's life and work the following words: "Almost any imaginative writer who creates a set of motives and signature tones for a character from history ends by writing a sort of autobiography. Sometimes this can happen unconsciously. The character begins as a set of facts and slowly melts into a set of fictions. The process is gradual and tentative. Gradually, the play or the novel or the story becomes a dramatization of an aspect of the secret self." So I was reading that and I was thinking about, in particular, the novels that are drawn clearly from your own family and their histories. As I said before, the three novels about the Dunns, and in fact, each of these three novels is about a set of siblings. Willie in the World War I novel, his sister Annie in a novel that's set in the late 50s, another sister who emigrates to North America, and then the three McNulty siblings in the other novels. And I'm just wondering if you just wanted, you've mentioned your great-grandfather, who's the parent of these Dunn siblings that we get to know so beautifully. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what exactly that process is. What is the alchemy that turns family stories into fiction, and exactly what has to take place in order for that to happen in a way that's satisfying to you?
Well, what is really deeply inconvenient, especially when you're a young writer, is that everyone has the right to keep secret their secret self. Their very happiness may depend on it. But the writer is impelled to publicly betray him or herself with this examination. And the reason you do it is because poor creature of the writer is a sort of Jesse James, or Billy the Kid is better, with Pat Garrett just behind in the next valley, bearing down on him. And you feel that you must do something before Pat catches it. And Pat's very polite and nice, but he's probably going to shoot you. And that feeling of emergency when I was young, I was a very unsettled young person. What I had was the composure to write. My composure consisted of writing. As Yeats said, I was a fool everywhere except at my desk. So it was a form of sanity, writing. My other difficulty as a human being was that all these books, and it remains my chief difficulty, the McNultys and the Dunns, only converge with the marriage of my mother and father, which is a place extremely difficult for me to go to, and the subsequent history of us as their children, and all the stuff that happened afterwards. The play Hinterland was a very clumsy attempt to breach that barrier and push on into this territory of almost the present. The other reason was I was looking at my family. I thought, they were wonderful in their own way. My mother was a huge personality, and my father was a very beautiful looking man with a big beard. And my Aunt Mary, sister of my mother, was a famous singer, the harpist Mary O'Hara. So, but they were actually quite dour a lot of the time. When you were with them as children, they weren't extremely cheerful people. And I was thinking, well, it'd be nice to have a bit of cheer in my life. And in fact, I probably need it in my secret self. So what I was also looking, and there were lots of people no one wanted to talk about, like these various lost figures in history, like Roseanne. My mother only referred to her as your woman. which is a very bad thing in Ireland. If you're referred to as your woman or your man, you know you're not, you have no credit in that household. So I was trying to bring these people back because I suspected that the cheer resided there, that the radiance and the beauty was in those lost people. So this has been my quite insane project of the last 42 years.
How far do you think you can bring it?
Well, how far can you go after Santa Fe? There's just, I don't know what's between here and California.
Well,
it's the unknown future.
But it seems like, all kidding aside, that the 6 novels essentially cover the 20th century. And the great-grandfather reaches back farthest in time, but one of the Dunn sisters emigrates, and she narrates her life and her grandchildren and children end up being involved in Vietnam and the Gulf War. So you sort of use these people to reach throughout the 20th century, one could say. And Bob, in fact, my friend that I was telling you about before, who actually wrote not only told me that I had to read this wonderful, fabulous book, Days Without End, but then wrote a review of it for the New York Review of Books because he wanted to make sure that as many people as possible knew how wonderful it was.
Which I've never read.
And
I told Bob I'd read it and thanked him, but I've never read it.
But he made an interesting point in the review, which is that the book that followed these 6 books is Days Without End, and you use a McNulty to reach backwards in time. So I guess the question is, do you think there's some kind of limit to using the family? Is it too close to comfort to come into the next generation? I mean, that's what I do. So I just want to know.
I do know. I mean, I'm aware of that. At 63, you become intensely aware of those questions and have no answers to them. I can see myself doing something a little bit, taking action in the face of that challenge. I've just, one of the reasons I came to here for 3 reasons. One is the Lannan Foundation is a wonderful institution. The other was that Daniel will be coming to interview. And the other reason was, for many years on my desk, I've had a picture by Edward Curtis, and he says a young desert woman. And it's this beautiful picture. And that for me was Winona in Days Without End. Now, the 2 men who take her initially as a servant have actually been engaged in the killing of her people. So it's a very uncomfortable idea in many ways. But when they get into a little family situation, because 2 men are so in love with each other, they have no idea there's a word for it. And they create this little family of themselves with Winona, this young Lakota Sioux woman, girl. She was only a child at the time. And maybe you've got to go where your instincts lead you. I have just finished a novel that is told by Winona. So here's this invented person. Am I laying claim to her as family? I have no right to do that in any way. But it seemed to me the next place to go. So do you know the thing when I don't know if you've ever had rats in your house or mice.
I have mice.
When you chase a rat,
I don't know if I should admit
it's very devious. He runs off into all sorts of places. And that's what I feel my work is doing. There's a stamping foot. You can't go on doing this forever. So I've stamped my foot, and now I'm off into the wainscoting with it. I am the rat. And I feel I've had the loveliest time writing this book, and I can see all the dangers. I'm very highly aware of the sensitivities around all these things, but you can only go through the door that has the bit of light leaking through it. That's the only one you can open.
So this brings me naturally to the question I wanted to ask next, which has to be with history. Because with Days Without End, you enter into a history which is not Irish history, certainly Irish history, breathes through the 6 novels I've mentioned before, and with significant moments, 1916, 1922. And I was we talked a little bit about this before, what kind of research. Now you're in America, you're doing a distinctly American kind of thing, and I don't want to ask you what kind of research you do to write a book about the American West, but I do want to ask you what you think the obligation of fiction is to history. Where does the two things collide, and how can it be done?
One of my closest friends is Roy Foster, who gloried up till recently in the title of Carroll Professor of Irish History at Oxford, which, believe me, is a very complicated phrase. And I've often told him I've tried to suggest to this eminent person the danger of writing history, the danger of assuming that because you've researched everything and you've found the documents, that you're being accurate and true, and that you might have a better chance in fiction. Now, he just discards this idea. He drinks another bottle of wine, tells me to shut up. But nevertheless, I do sort of believe it, that there's a way of getting at things in the writing of a book as if you were there. And we, one of the beauties of Einstein's theory of time is that he is suggesting that all time events, and we just don't have the capacity to understand this, are happening everywhere, always, discreetly. So there is no such thing as past, present, and future. Everything is happening. So if you make a huge effort to try and go back to the 1850s, to Missouri or whatever, you do have to read 150 books. And believe me, I couldn't read till I was about 8. And the idea still of reading 150 books is not a happy idea for me, but that's your responsibility. You must put something into the top part of your brain. The weird part of it is that it's not that part of the brain you write out of. It's some other mysterious room, possibly windowless, doorless, where some of that stuff you've read seems to sink through very slowly. There's that wonderful word stupid, which in Latin is stupidus, which just means something it takes a long time to get through. And this reading you've done, little bits of it come in. Like the detail of when you're hunting a buffalo, which I do think you should remember when you are hunting buffalo, that she will try and come at you very suddenly. It's that sort of detail that brings you there. It puts you back there as if Einstein is pristinely correct. And there's no such thing as narrative time, even though, of course, the novel glories in narrative, and then, and then, and then. So yes, you assuage the sort of remnant, decrepit, tuppenny halfpenny scholar in you, and you read all the books. But ultimately, that's not the thing you're calling to. It's something much more mysterious, much more disreputable, much less grand, much more democratic, and much more wonderful, I think. That we have in our brains these stories that could already be there in the sense that they are found texts. And if you were just so foolish as to devote your life to writing, which I don't recommend to anybody, you might just perforce, by mere passage of time, find yourself accessing these things. Because my firm belief is that Winona was in there to tell her story. And nothing could be more disreputable or more unlikely than that.
But I guess the issue for me is as a nonfiction writer.
Yes.
So I, at one point, was writing about the Holocaust, and I felt extremely constrained in moments where I had to describe certain kinds of things that happened, where I didn't feel it was possible for me at a certain point to do anything but quote historical records, because I didn't feel I was allowed in some way to reconstruct the horror of other people's experience, which I couldn't possibly pretend to even understand. And I guess also as a critic, I always think of this, this problem in movies, historical movies, and it also happens in historical fiction, where you see the research, but that's all you see. You see what I'm saying? So what is the X factor that, of course, you need to know, I guess, about buffalo hunts, and you can research buffalo hunts and know that the lady buffalo is going to do this and whatever. I'm just trying to be polite. And
how do you do?
And But like, what? How, you know, how would you characterize the thing that makes it more than just the accumulation of the research?
As I suspected, your problem, and your beautiful problem, is you have a nobility of mind. Fiction writers just haven't got that. They are not Pat Garrett, who would have a nobility of mind, because he doesn't think you should be robbing trains. But no, you're that other Irish scoundrel, Billy, trying to get down to Mexico. In a way, for me, history writing, well, just to keep it in the animal world, history writing is like dressage, you know, where there's great control over the horse, and you must have it. And there's no point doing dressage unless you're a supremely accomplished rider. Mm-hmm. But the fiction writer has no stirrups. If he has strength in his right hand to hold onto the mane, he's in good fettle. And he's just going like hell across the prairie and hoping for the best, basically. Yeah.
Now you see why I was texting all my friends last night.
But I will say in your book about your incredible book, you know, unprecedented book about teaching the Odyssey in New York with your father in attendance. It is a deeply fictional book. I mean, you have, in places in that book, decided, you know, to give that fine horse a good old crazy gallop across the sand. Because things happen in that book that are... See, when we say fictional, sometimes we say, oh, that's a fiction, as if that was a lower thing. For me, fiction, the power of fiction is to make everything seem true, even more so when they're not true. Mm-hmm. There's a little thing in Days Without End, it's now excised. It was read by 7 or 8 people, brilliant people, editors, line editors, designers, the whole book. There was a reference, this is set in the 1850s, and there was a reference to the Charleston in the book. I mean, the Charleston was invented, I think, in 1910. But I didn't notice because I'm an idiot, but they didn't notice either. And the reason is, Thomas spoke to me so clearly in my workroom, and is so convincing, that when you read it, you think that everything he's saying is true, even when it isn't true. Mm-hmm. But what does this mean for us as a creature? There is paradoxically a sort of majesty in it. Do you know, it is like a naked king. When kings in Ireland, to be proven, were stripped naked and checked for scars. If they had any scars, you can go home, you're not going to be king. And then they'd get a big skillet or a big pot and kill a horse. And there's a lot of horses this evening. And boil up a nice horse stew, which I can't imagine what that tastes like. And you'd put the king in it. And the king would boil in the stew till he could not bear it. And that somehow was his... You know, I mean, we're talking here about mad processes. And to make something. And I do think, as your most recent friend, we've had dinner and lunch together, so basically we're old friends. I do think, I would be my prayer that you would, you know, give that horse its hay and take it down to yon great field and write a fiction book. Would you mind doing that?
Well, I think the question is, and we talked a little bit about this.
Can I sing you the song?
What?
Oh, rise up, lovely Sweeney, and give your horse some hay. There you go.
Well, that's...
Rise up,
likely
lovely
the
Daniel.
only time this Jewish boy is going to be called Sweeney.
Oh, I don't know. Sweeney was definitely
Jewish. That may be the novel. No, but I mean, clearly what's at issue here is something about, not about fiction or nonfiction, but narrative, right? A narrative is a shapely object. And if you give, I was going to say facts, but of course it isn't facts. You know, if you give elements of a story a good shape, it satisfies, and it's irrelevant whether it really happened or you made it all up. What people want, this much seems clear, right? We're creatures of narrative. And so there's something funny that you actually said. I had taken a note about, you talk about the character of Thomas McNulty in Days Without End. And I'm going to get this wrong, but it was something like, it was some relative of yours had talked about a great uncle who'd gone to America and he'd been scalped in Texas. And you sort of grinned during this interview and said, well, not really, but, you know, does it matter in a funny way, you know? I want to shift slightly to the quality of radiance, which is, if you have read this book, it is a radiant...
Can we just talk about facts for 1 second?
Facts.
Hold that thought, okay? Facts, there are facts that you need to bring with you for life, and then there are discardable facts. And the thing is, when you read the 150 books, the little bits you need get through to the place you write out of. And, you know, when in particular, when people were going west, whether it was the Santa Fe Trail or more likely Oregon Trail, when they got past certain points and were hungry and tired, they started to throw things out of the wagons. Pianos. So that you'd come down into the desert, soldiers in patrol, and find in the middle of the desert a piano or a lovely Viennese bookcase. Because these were the discardable items. In order to reach where they were trying to get to in California, they needed to just bring the things they needed. And that, for me, is research. You just leave the piano out on the planes.
Yeah. But you know, I would say in a good historical novel, you sort of feel that the piano was there without having to see it. You know, you feel the research, but you don't...
It's very beautiful.
You don't. No, it isn't. All right, we're going on. We're moving on. We're moving on to radiance. So I was going to say...
About 1 a.m. this morning, I'll know what that means. I'll think about it.
I'm about to tell you. So a critic, not myself, remarked about another one of your books that you are, and I'm quoting here, too kindly to be cruel, too forgiving to be despairing, too in love with life's inconsequentiality not to cherish all those little moments that are made more beautiful by the aching acknowledgement of how transient they are, end of quote. And this was in the context of a discussion of the fact, quite seriously, that so much of the Irish history that you're writing about is not a happy history. And it is striking when you go through your work about, there's a striking motif, and you get it in every single book. And as you know, I was just rereading Annie Dunn, and it registered, but there's this wonderful passage that I'm going to quote from Days Without End. And people in your novels are always saying things like, this is so mortifying to have to read your text after you did. I was sore in love with all my laboring in Tennessee, liked well that life, up with the cockcrow, bed with the dark, going along like that could never end, and when ending it would be felt to be just. You had your term, all that stint of daily life we sometimes spit on like it was something waste, but it is all there is, and in it is enough. And there are so many wonderful moments in your books of characters reflecting on the pleasurableness of the small, inconsequential things of life. And I just want you to talk about this motif of the enjoyment of simple pleasures, because it seems to me that it is the great counterweight to the horrors that haunt all these characters.
Well, our duty as parents and grandparents is to be with our babies, to be with our children. And if you're a grandparent, like my grandfather, when you're going west to see the people at the other side of the country, he used to throw me in the red Cortina, and bring me over. In fact, if he hadn't done that, I'd have nothing to write about. But it was that gesture of inclusion that gave rise to many thousands of small incidents between us that were of such quality as to actually partly to expose the rather barren terrain of my own house, but also to redeem it. Auntie Anne, Annie's Dunn, as she is in the book, my auntie, great aunt Annie, more or less was, and this is related to how I write, was more or less my rescuer, my second rescuer in childhood, because we would be put with her in the country. She was a woman with a hump, born with a hump, or possibly got a hump from polio, and therefore was considered unmarriageable and extra, and suffered greatly from that. But when we were deposited with her as children, coming from the little warp of our home plays, she brought us into the house and minutely mothered us and showed us the firelight in the plates on the dresser and made us listen to the cricket, the actual cricket in the hearth, and made the bread right in front of us in the pot oven, and went out with our cousin Sarah, and they shared a bed, the two of them, to show you how to feed the hens, to stand in front of the hens and throw the grain at them like they were enemies, and the hens loving them back like proper enemies. All that, and going down to the well with Auntie Anne as a little boy of 4, and the hook of her hand in my little hand, and her other hook on the zinc bucket, and the two of us standing at the well waiting for the water to clear, because that old witch across the road had been using it, and our cows had TB and God knows what was in the water now, and the hawthorn dripping in the rain. This was a medicine. This was our buffalo scrotum of good medicine. As children, this is what kept us alive, and that's why it's in the books, because I think that is the current, that is the possible redemption of being alive. And everyone here has hard lives, God knows. But these things that give us that frisson, that electrical current of life, like we were sort of Frankenstein also. We need to be plugged in, or Frankenstein's monster. We need that electricity of love and kindness to exist. Otherwise, we are actually in deep trouble. But
it comes out so. It comes out so. I think it comes out most strongly and purely in Annie Dunn, because that's basically the whole book. Is this element.
It was my manual of safety for my brother, who was 13 years younger than me and who became schizophrenic. And it was my effort, a place he would never have known because he was too young. I actually wrote that book to create an idea for him of safety and recovery. That's well observed. That's what that book is. It's like a little memoriam for me also of total ridiculous, cheek-splitting happiness as a child.
Well, it comes through. The final thing I wanted to talk about was madness. It's a strong element from, and actually, as I think, in The Steward of Christendom, you're talking also, it's a play, but it's about your grandfather and Roseanne in The Secret Scripture is sectioned, and there's an incredible story in Annie Dunn about a young boy who in a sort of fit murders his mother, and I just wanted to hear what you had to say. I mean, it's a thread, and I'm very interested in it.
I was very enchanted reading. I was writing a play about Dickens and Anderson meeting, and Dickens was terrified of asylums, as they were called, because I think his mother had been committed. And Anderson was terrified too, because his grandparents had been committed. My great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, whom I knew as a little boy in Sligo, as a result of my grandfather, their son, throwing me in the Red Cortina. They were still alive in their 90s. They literally met in the Sligo lunatic asylum. He was the tailor and she was the seamstress. And they actually met over the cutting table. So, you can't get deeper in than that. And there's a feeling, an asylum is a beautiful word. And there were times in the history of psychology and psychiatry when, for Van Gogh maybe, where asylum was a sanctuary where you could be comforted in your distress. And nothing more distressing than mental illness for the sufferer, because it's so invisible. Better to have your leg hanging off by a thread than that. And people tell you to shake out of it or shape up, or whatever they want to say to you. These places were, my household had two elements. One was my grandfather, who told me everything except the truth. But beautifully. Oh my God, we were in the bed together, it's freezing cold Irish winter, him farting away, keep the heat in, and telling me all this. This is one of the consequences of an oil strike in Ireland, if you want to know. You need to have a fairly wonderful grandfather of that kind. But on the other side of the house, my mother specialized in telling family secrets, actually. This brings us full circle. And she delighted in telling them to me, anyway. I don't know if she thought I'd keep them all secret. Of course, I've written them all out. And she would tell me all the things my grandfather wouldn't say. So she would give an accurate description of this institution, of the asylum. And they were all the children and the grandchildren of this world, which was actually a big employer in Sligo, strangely enough. Also, because people were put in who weren't mad, but were considered socially unacceptable, like Roseanne later on. Sligo, the neighbouring county to Sligo is Leitrim, and the nickname for the Sligo Asylum was the Leitrim Hotel, because half of Leitrim was supposed to be in it. And there are not a lot of people in Leitrim, actually, to this day. Maybe that's the reason. So it was, it was a terrifying place, and the Steward of Christendom himself is in terror of being put in the county home. The last place he wanted to end up in was destitute in the county home. And he, who has been a high-ranking policeman, utterly undone by history and possibly by himself, finds himself in a pair of dirty long johns in these places. So, they are my people, so this is a terrain that, this is a place that... There was an incredible moment, actually. Ivor Browne, our great psychiatrist, he gloried in the title of Chief Psychiatrist of Ireland. What could be more wonderful than that? But one night his asylum was on fire, many years ago, and he brought me up to see it. He was going to have to do something for his men, as he called them. And his men were all in their suits, like probably my grandfather, great-grandfather made, was such a terrible tailor. I think they all were going around looking like him. He said, "They're my men there." He brought me in through the asylum and in through a long corridor of women, a long ward of women. There were about 50 or 60 women, and all different ages, in the beds, very quiet. And the great windows of the asylum, and on the lights of the city below. And as I moved through this place I would never normally be in, I thought, but these are all the mothers and the daughters and the grandmothers and the sisters and the cousins of the city. And literally nobody knows they're here. So it's also that impulse to go and retrieve them. And we've talked about history. And even if it's the First World War, if Willie Dunn had gone to Russia to join the Bolshoi Ballet, I would have followed him there. It's not so much I'm after history as because we're all both feet in history. We're all mired in history.
Right.
So you'll find us there. But it's this little notion of rescue, because Auntie Anne and my grandfather rescued me as a child. So I suppose I regard it as my duty and my responsibility to do it, even in this fictional realm.
Well, I think you've paid that debt beautifully.
Oh, thank you, Dan.
In some Einsteinian parallel universe, we are just beginning this conversation. But unfortunately, we have to end it, I see, from the terrifying hotel alarm clock. So thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.